Ozark healers and how they have evolved and passed down for centuries. Gustav is a local illustrator and comic creator. He's a fan of drawing ghosts, aliens, and other things that go bump in the night. And just so everyone knows, there is going to be a little drawing giveaway. So I am going to be back there. I'm going to have a random person spin a number generator. There's 80 of you here today. And we are going to count starting here, 1 through, and it'll start the next row through there, just so you know how I'm counting. And that person will win a drawing by Gustav. He will also be drawing and kind of showing you some things, I think. Yeah, but unfortunately we won't have anything on the screen. It did not want to work for us today, so sorry about that. But other than that, Brandon and Gustav.
Thank you. All right, welcome everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I always recognize the projection of the mic is out, and the volume is lower back here. So welcome everyone. Yeah, hate that we can't have these great drawings up on the screen. I'm going to enjoy them while we're talking. So and then we'll get to show you what's going on.
And just to do a magician trick thing to show where we're at the beginning. I've got a light blue sketch mark that you're not going to be able to see, but by the end there should be actual line work.
Should be.
Should be. We'll see.
So welcome everyone. We're going to talk about monsters today, specifically Ozark monsters. My name is Brandon Weston, like our great intro said. And one of the things that I like to study in the Ozarks is all of the weird creatures that are here, and we'll kind of look at not just the monsters, but we also have a lot of just animal folklore in the Ozarks. We also have great folklore about fairies and all of the little people and the sprites and spook lights and all of that good stuff. We also have a lot of ghost stories, spirit stories. I've even got a little bit of a witch story at the end, because we've got a lot of very good witch folklore here in the Ozarks. So we're going to try to keep that to an hour and a half, but we'll see, depending on how much we get to talking. We really wanted this to sort of be kind of almost like a campfire type storytelling event. So not so much a lecture as giving you some good examples of stories that perhaps you haven't heard, and many that maybe you have. And as a folklorist, a part of what I study is folklore within families. And that's kind of the most interesting part about Ozark folklore, and where I got my start was studying all of those weird stories that my grandpa always told me, and aunts and uncles and things like that. I think one of the first creature stories I ever remember was my grandpa during the summertime. He would always warn us when we were outside playing to beware of the hoop snake. Has anybody heard of the hoop snake? A few hoop snake people here. So for those of you who don't know the hoop snake is a specific type of snake, a specific species. Color combinations and all of that vary from story to story. My grandpa always used to say it looked like one of the big black king snakes. But the specific feature of the hoop snake is that when it senses danger around, it will bite its own tail and then roll like a wagon wheel or like a hoop across the ground. And then this is the interesting part about folklore in general, where folklore changes from teller to teller, storyteller to storyteller, and as we pass this down. So the hoop snake story, I've collected probably 100 different variations on the hoop snake story. And in some of the stories, the hoop snake will roll away. It'll just try to get away. It doesn't want to be around you. It wants to get out of here. But by far, the most popular variation on the hoop snake story is that it will roll after you and actually chase you around. And my grandpa always used to say that if you're not careful, if it gets to you, it will spit poison at you. It can actually have this poison that it spits. I guess technically
has
venom.
To stop being the hoop at that point.
Yes, it goes from being the hoop snake at that point to kind of a spitting, almost like cobra-esque type snake. So
Well, I kind of love that because it's like you get the Ozarkers introducing to the concept of Ouroboros through a
Yes.
threatening snake.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Rolling away.
The cycles always continue into the future. Yes, I did a talk one time, and we introduced the hoop snake as the Ozark Ouroboros, and I really like that as an image. So yeah, folklore for me is life. It's what I love. It's what I do. And I think the most fascinating part for me looking at folklore is not where the folklore stays the same, but where it changes. And so throughout, all of the stories that we're going to tell and talk about today, I want you to think back and sort of back to your own childhoods when you were listening to stories, or as an adult, liking, enjoying folklore and things like that. And sort of, if some of these stories remind you of stories that you've heard, think about where the changes are, and think about, maybe why a storyteller would want to make certain changes at certain times. One feature of Ozark storytelling is, every storyteller will adapt stories to the audience that they are telling them to. And so this is where we get all of these beautiful variations. And so while it's very important for us to, preserve stories, preserve folklore word for word for the folk record and for the archives, we also have to understand that storytelling and folk traditions in general they're living traditions. They're ever evolving. And especially in the Ozarks, where historically you have so many different families separated by so much land, that families were often telling similar stories in different ways. And so I think that's my little intro to this storytelling event. I'm so glad that you all are here, and I hope you enjoy some of the things that we have to talk about. So let's get into the good stuff. Monsters. I've kind of divided this up into different categories that sort of help us to be able to compartmentalize what is a very complex area in folk studies, which is storytelling. So I want to start with the monster section because that is by far the most popular one usually.
Yes, often so.
All the storytellers love telling a good monster story. So who's heard of the Gowrow? Oh, a few Gowrow aficionados here. Molly, I know, knows a lot about the Gowrow, yeah. So the Gowrow at one point was sort of the most famous Ozark cryptid, I guess you could say. This is kind of an area where, today we like to talk about cryptids, but that's kind of a modern sort of way of looking at monsters.
It becomes more of a way to define monsters than to tell stories about them, I often find.
Right,
So it
yeah.
gets into tricky territory.
The cryptid sort of blends into the sort of like the bestiary tradition, I guess, where it's like you're doing more of a scientific study of the creature.
Well, and it becomes so much about making a monster much more provable as a thing, as a living thing, which also tends to kind of wash away all of the fun folkloric flavor of the creature.
Right.
Something goofy might disappear. You're not going to find a hoop snake in cryptozoology.
No,
but
likely
you will in
not.
folklore.
And many people have, this is also where it sort of gets over into this area of like cryptids often require evidence, the sort of, whereas folklorists is, my grandpa always used to say when I asked him, well, have you ever seen a hoop snake? He would always say, yeah, I saw one just the other day. And so, he's like, oh, okay, well, I trust my grandpa, maybe. The Gowrow was definitely one of these as well. And so if any of you are familiar with the folklorist Vance Randolph, he has a section in his Ozark Magic and Folklore book about the Gowrow, and actually has newspaper articles, quotes from newspaper articles mentioning people who had encountered the Gowrow, but not quite encountering the Gowrow. They all discovered the lairs of the Gowrow, which are these sort of subterranean caverns filled with bones, specifically bones of cattle deer, things like that. For flavor, occasionally they would throw in that they found human bones that were, being tested currently, that sort of thing.
How much do you want to terrify the children when you tell the story? Basically, is
yeah,
what is in the cave?
Yeah. We have varying degrees of, are we telling the story to adults who want to chill or to children? But the Gaurau, there's lots of different ways of describing the Gaurau, but generally speaking, the Gaurau is a fearsome dragon-like lizard. A giant lizard, straight from sort of dinosaur days, that has, for some reason, has survived for a millennia in the Ozark caverns. And so it is a subterranean dwelling creature. It lives down in the caves. It comes out at night to grab a cow out of a field or, I don't know, an unsuspecting traveler and pull it down into its lair to eat. And so the claims of having seen the Gaurau all described it as being this monstrous sort of lizard with tusks. So it has these two long tusks coming out of its mouth, which is sort of a defining feature of it. But this is where the stories kind of change sometimes, though, because when the Gaurau was first presented, a spelunker had been exploring the caves and supposedly came across this cavern that was filled with these bones. And as he was exploring, he saw this monstrous tusked creature in the cavern, and just below us in our Ozark caverns. And so he had, of course, rushed to the newspaper to describe this to a journalist who was willing to listen.
I believe his name was E.J. James,
Yeah.
a landowner that owned a small cave, or really a fissure, called Devil's Hole outside of Self, Arkansas.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up an interesting point, too. There's lots of these devil holes around the Ozarks. We unfortunately won't get to talk about the devil much in this. Maybe that's a separate talk altogether, because there's a lot of devil folklore in the Ozarks as well. But a lot of these monsters are associated with these sort of well-known and famous caves or crevices, fissures, sinkholes that have some sort of spookiness about them to begin with. And so, a cavern that for, as all the people that lived on the land around it, somebody in the family would always hurt themselves in the cave or something like that. And so the Gaurau was discovered in one of these sort of already widely known as being a little bit of a spooky cavern. And so after that, though, suddenly all these people were seeing the Gaurau. It started popping up. More newspapers were covering it. Actual zoologists were starting to go out trying to find the Gaurau and locate it. And this is where some of the descriptions start to change. So the Gaurau, fearsome dragon-like lizard with tusks, sometimes often takes on a sort of elephant sort of appearance.
Kind of often description.
And there was actually an article that I saw where they were trying to link the Gaurau to perhaps a frozen mastodon that had been trapped in one of the Ozark caverns. And they were actually seeing this frozen mastodon instead of this Gaurau. So, and it also started to take on hippo qualities as well.
Which, interestingly, so does a lot of Arkansas cryptids start to get into that sort of pachyderm territory because the White River monster also often very hippo-based.
Yeah. The White River monster being another sort of famous cryptid that had about 1 million different descriptions depending on who was seeing it. So the Gaurau was an interesting one that, fortunately for all of you cave explorers out there, to this date, no one has ever really succumbed to the Gaurau that we know of anyway.
Well, there is one story that gets attributed to newspapers, but then you look for the actual newspaper article and it's nowhere to be found.
Of course.
About a Gaurau attacking a group of people trying to capture it for killing livestock, where it's using its scythe-like tail to dismember all of the people trying to find it. And of course, they finally kill it and take a picture of it, but the picture gets lost.
Of course.
And then they send the body to the Smithsonian, and then of course, it gets lost in the mail.
Of course.
This will happen a lot with the bodies of cryptids.
Yes. Yeah, and the sort of discovery of the physical evidence that then, of course, unfortunately doesn't get corroborated because it's one person saw it, or it gets lost in the mail, that sort of thing.
And it makes me think of another flavor of Gowrow story, which is much more based around hucksterism than I would say any kind of actual lore of any kind. But there was also a bit of a fable about them being in love with apples. So they would eat apples in great numbers. So apple orchards would set up, hucksters around apple orchards would set up these tents and be like, for a small fee, you can come see the Gowrow. And they would take all the fee, everyone would get in the tent, you'd start hearing this loud catastrophe, and the person who let you in, this ringleader, would be like, the Gowrow has escaped. And you would find a big cage with a hole at the bottom that they dug out. So.
Dang, it's unfortunate he was just escaping every weekend.
Every weekend.
Yeah.
They called him Houdini.
We need to build stronger cages, I guess. But that's sort of, people take their monster stories very seriously. And again, I recommend the folklorist Vance Randolph. He collected a lot of very interesting monster stories. And so the Gowrow being our sort of most famous monster, there are other ones as well. Some of you have probably heard of the Wampus Cat. The Wampus Cat is another one of these well-documented monsters. As it's described, sometimes it's just described as a big cougar. Sometimes it's a black panther. And in the stories that I've collected, it's specifically a six-legged panther that is very fearsome, said to be able to run as fast as a car. So even if you try to get away that way, it can still catch up to you, and they are very ferocious. They're also a cave dweller too, and I think a lot of our cryptid stories harken back to our landscape. So not just the forested landscape, but also the features of the caves that are underneath us. And if you can imagine yourself as a old Ozarker in these rural areas, you don't really even have roads. You're taking things to town by mule, and you have all of these caves around you. And I just imagine, being kind of freaked out about that, and the mystery of wanting to go into the cave versus being afraid of the cave, that sort of thing. And so a lot of our cryptids have this sort of subterranean quality about them.
I like to think that's where our karst topography comes from, is all these critters tunneling them out.
Yeah, right, yeah. Just the sheer number of creatures just, sort of tunneling things out. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if some of these stories might be explained by people coming across like bluff shelters and stuff.
Yeah, well, 100%, yeah.
Hunters might have had bones strewn.
Well, and also, I mean, a lot of these caverns, because we have so many of these caves too, that a lot of them actually held bones of mastodons and things like that. And so, it's not inconceivable to think of somebody having stumbled upon a cavern that was maybe recently opened up, that had been sealed for thousands of years, and coming across very strange bones or features and things like that. And so I think when we talk about storytelling, stories, they don't just pop out of nowhere. Stories are always based on reality, even the most far-fetched ones. And
it's not for nothing that all of these are telling us to stay out of caves.
Exactly. Well, and yes, this gets into a lot of the monster stories are also cautionary tales, like the hoop snake. What my grandpa wasn't really warning me about was the hoop snake. He was warning me against, snakes in general, to be careful when I was outside in the woods. And if I saw a snake, I would immediately think, oh, it's the hoop snake, I got to get out of here. Whereas, maybe I wouldn't think to myself, this might be a copperhead or a venomous snake, that sort of thing.
The fun parallel for me, being a child of back to landers, is the stories that my parents were told were more of the snipe hunt for than the cautionary tale.
Yeah, the fun varieties where, for the snipe hunt, for those of you who don't know, the snipe is a bird that doesn't exist, but is when you go on a snipe hunt, it's taking somebody that doesn't know the bird doesn't exist on a hunt for a thing that doesn't exist. And so there's actually a lot of stories about these sorts of trips that are humorous stories for, so that the people in the know will be able to laugh at it, and the people that don't know are the ones that are the butt of the joke usually for that. The Wampus cat, one of our fearsome creatures. And just to go through a few others that are a part of folklore, these are some of my favorite ones that maybe you all have heard of or have not. Has anybody heard of the Gaiastacutus? Any Gaiastacutus fans? This is one of my favorites just because the word is very strange. I have a feeling the folklorists probably made it up, but it is based on other accounts of specifically giant buzzards, giant vultures. The Gaiastacutus is a monstrous-sized vulture that lives in some of these bluff shelters that you get along the high cliffs, and it is big enough to come down and take away cattle. Another feature of most of our Ozark stories is the disappearance of cattle, or chickens, or
You'll notice
horses.
This being a continuing theme with monster stories, whether they're cryptozoology or folklore, always involve the death of livestock.
Yeah, well, it's important, and it's, probably the farmers are the ones that are going to be figuring this stuff out the first, because, all of these creatures want their cattle for some reason, so. But the Gaiastacutus is a giant buzzard. It's also sometimes called king buzzard. There's a lot of very interesting buzzard folklore in the Ozarks. We might talk a little bit about that in the animal section, but the Gaiastacutus, by and large, is not a natural buzzard. It is a monstrous buzzard. It's also related to the bald knob buzzard. If anybody's heard of the bald knob buzzard. The bald knob buzzard was interesting because it apparently had one wing that was shorter than the other, and so it only flew in circles. And that's how you could sort of notice, unlike a regular buzzard, which will often circle things that are dead, the bald knob buzzard, that's the only way it could fly.
How does a bald knob buzzard circle a hoop snake?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting thought. I also think, like, how would a bald knob buzzard circle the dead stuff like buzzards normally circle too? So, one of my other favorite ones on a very related sort of note is the side hill hoofer. Anybody heard of the side hill hoofer? A lot of this stuff comes from lumberjack folklore as well. Farmers, spelunkers, and lumberjacks. These are our cryptid finders. These are the ones who, in the Ozarks at least, were the ones that first encountered a lot of these monsters and often were the ones actively being attacked by them. So the side hill hoofer is sometimes described as a cross between a sheep and an armadillo. And it runs around the base of the hills, and so it just keeps running through these hollers all the way around these hills. And it can only run in one direction because its legs on one side of its body are shorter than the other, which makes it very skilled at running across the hills, whereas we would lose our footing easily. It is actually able to do this with great skill. And it's said that they have a very tasty meat, and so they're often hunted. And the easiest way to kill them or catch them is all you have to do is get in front of it, and it will stop, and it can't turn around because its feet are short on one side. It can only go in one direction. So if you can get in front of it, it'll stop, and then all you have to do is flip it over, and it won't be able to right itself again. And so that's a very easy way of being able to catch it. One of our other probably origins from the lumberjacks is the high behind, or is sometimes called the hide behind. Vance Randolph calls it the high behind, and in his accounts he describes it as another sort of lizard creature that is kind of shaped weird. It walks on its back legs, and so it has like a high butt kind of up in the air. I've also heard it described as a hide behind because it specifically is very tall and very skinny, so it hides behind trees. And specifically, as it hides behind the trees, if you come through, then it will reach out and grab you, of course, and eat you. I don't know. No, I've never heard of anyone getting attacked by one, so maybe they're friendly, actually, and we just don't know. We're just scared of them all the time.
There's almost a will-o-wisp kind of energy to them, except with a more physicality that you're not used to with them, where it's always behind you, but you'll never see it.
Yeah, and if you see it, well, then it's too late.
Yeah, exactly. So you can never disprove it.
No,
It's perfect like that.
Yeah, and you just got to believe me. The hide behind was definitely there. I heard it squawking, or I don't know, whatever sound it makes. One of my favorite monsters is, of course, the Snoffus.
Yes.
Do any Snoffus fans? And yes, the Snoffus. So the Snoffus, spelled Snawfus, Snoffus. The Snoffus is, I think, one of the more beautiful cryptids in the Ozarks. It has a little bit of a danger about it, but the Snoffus is, in most accounts, is described as an all-white deer, and instead of antlers, it has flowering branches. It is also described in some stories as it is the beast that creates the fog in the valleys. I've collected a few Snoffus stories from around Ponca, where the elk are. One in particular, a gentleman that I talked to, he said that, oh yeah, if you get up early enough in the morning, you'll see it jumping through the pine trees, breathing out the fog into Ponca Valley there. So it is. There's a lot of very interesting folklore around the Snoffus. It is considered sort of a magical creature. This kind of harkens back to European folklore, where the white deer was often seen as an omen of death or an omen of the other world. So that probably has some connections to the white color of the Snoffus. The Snoffus is sometimes a bringer of death, but is also sometimes an omen of good things. So an omen, of treasure, things like that. What you don't want to do is you don't want to ever kill the Snoffus or try to kill the Snoffus. So I have a story about the Snoffus in particular. This story came from a hunter friend of mine. And though that's another category of people that always encounter cryptids, are the hunters. Lots of hunter lore there.
Coincidentally, always people that have been alone in the woods for a very long time.
For a very long time, and usually have gotten through several bottles of whiskey.
Yes,
That's
by
that point.
Generally a component.
So this hunter friend of mine, so he kind of also put it in a good way that hunters, when you're hunting in particular deer, you're the ones that, you get up before the break of dawn. And that's a lot of the times when these cryptids, when these creatures will be out and about. So hunters are often, in the trees before sunrise, and so and often very late into the night too. And so this is a story that was given to me by this hunter friend of mine. He never claimed that it happened to him, which is, stories often are removed like that. This happened to a friend of mine, so don't ask me any more details about it, because it happened to somebody else. But it did happen. So this is the story of a hunter, and this happened in the Ozarks a long, long time ago, as most of our stories begin. A long time ago in the Ozarks, there was a hunter who went out early one morning, trekking through the snows into a deep valley, trying to catch a deer for his family. As he went out, he got his area together where his blind was going to be, and he waited. And he heard through the snow, he saw a white bird. He heard a call first, but then saw this white bird. And he couldn't quite tell if it was an eagle, but he had never seen an eagle that was all white. And he saw it come down and catch a fish out of the river and then fly back up into a tree. And he said to himself, if I could get that bird, that might be something. That I might be able to sell maybe the pelt, or maybe it's a magic bird and I'll get some magic powers from eating the meat of this bird. And maybe it'll give me and my family some luck. So he took aim at the bird and he fired a shot. And even though his aim was sure, the shot missed completely. And the bird flew away. So the rest of the day he didn't catch anything. He returned home empty-handed, unfortunately. The next morning, he said, I'm determined to catch something. We need to get through the winter. So he went out again to a different spot. Again, he saw the white bird come through. This time, it came down and it grabbed a rabbit off the ground and took it up into a tree. And he took his time. He was very patient. He said, I'm going to get this bird one way or another. He made sure the shot was lined up. He pulled the trigger. And again, he missed. He couldn't conceive of how he could have missed. And the rest of the day, his luck was just like the first time. Bad luck all day, and couldn't catch anything else. So the next morning, he went out a third time. But this time, before he went out, his very wise wife, who had been seeing him come home every night empty-handed, and talking, the rest of the night, well into the night, about this stupid bird that he just couldn't catch. She said, well, maybe if it is a magical bird, maybe you can only kill it with a silver bullet. And he said, that's genius. Why didn't I think of that? And so he melted down a silver coin into a bullet. And he took it out, and he went to a different spot on the river this time. And sure enough, the bird came just as the sun was about to rise over the horizon. And he took the bullet, he put it into his gun. He said, I've only got one shot. This was my silver coin. If I wasted it, I don't know what I'm going to do. So he lined up the shot, he took the shot, and he got the bird. The bird fell to the ground. He rushed over to the bird, but instead of a bird, there was an old man on the ground with a big white beard that was wrapped around his body. And the hunter was shocked. He said, how could this have happened? And the man was bleeding from his shoulder. And so he was in shock. The man came to, and he said, if you help me, I'll make sure that you will always have a deer in your home. You'll always have food on your table. And so the man helped him. He bandaged up his wound. He used some of his own bandages and cloth that he had, and the old man disappeared into the snow. So the hunter went back home and told this to his wife, who was certain he had gotten through most of his moonshine that day, probably. She didn't believe him about it. The next day, he went out to the same spot to see if he could find a deer, and he was still kind of shaken by this whole experience. And pretty soon, he wasn't there more than 10 minutes, a big buck came into view, the biggest one he'd ever seen. And he was able to get this buck and take it home. And as he was dragging it out, he looked across the field, and he saw an all-white buck with flowering branches as antlers, with a long white beard. And he knew that he did a good thing saving this magical creature. And so this sort of exchange comes up in folklore a lot. The saving of the creature, the saving of the magical creature, and in return we gain some boon from the magical creature. The Snoffus seems to be one of these that has several of those stories about it.
This is where I really wish the visual component was working out. But yeah, the Snoffus is one of those ones that I also think is kind of growing in kind of knowledge around it. And how could it not? It's one of our most stunning looking cryptids, creatures, really. I'm trying to get away from the word cryptid as I go
Cryptid.
further.
I like the word cryptid, but it does tend to bring up the Bigfoot sort of
Yes.
connotations. And Arkansas at least, we do have the Fouke monster, which is our Arkansas Bigfoot, or one variety probably. I've never encountered any sort of like specific Ozark-based Bigfoot.
There are a few, but they're far and few between. The best Bigfoot example I can think of is actually in recent history in 2012, where it was at Steel Creek in Ponca, outside of Ponca in Newton County, where a few park rangers were very befuddled to discover a group of 32 Bigfoot hunters doing an expedition in the Steel Creek wilderness. It turns out that's against the law, and they were all fined for hunting Bigfoot without a permit. Now, that was kind of a joking extrapolation, of course, of probably like event permits and things like that. But there is actually in Arkansas, one of our actual monsters is legally protected on the White River, which has its own White River monster refuge where we're not allowed to harm it. So, but those are less out in the Ozarks. But there's also the Ozarks Blue Man. There is a story that Otto Ernest Rayburn writes about in Ozark Country about a wild man that is captured in Saline County and taken to jail, where they clothe him. And then the wild man, who is covered in hair and 7 feet tall, rips off the clothes and rips out the jail bars and runs back into the wilderness. We also have Smokey Joe out of Camp Orr. But a lot of these are largely wild man traditions and not so much Bigfoot traditions. And the thing about a lot of Bigfoot kind of lore that you will find is that a lot of Bigfoot lore backfills other folklore and tries to claim it as its own. Which is to say that, like, on a long enough time scale, all cryptids and local legends start to turn into Bigfoot, whether that fits or not. And which makes sense if you're trying to make these plausible creatures. We make them more human-shaped every day to make them plausible. And I think that kind of goes against some of these more fun ones. And that's kind of why I get a little cryptozoology fighty nowadays. Which this was also how I came in through. It was kind of in search of documentary type stuff. So, but.
Well, I think I like that idea of like everything getting subsumed under just Bigfoot, and it reminds me. So there's an Ozark fairy that is most often described as a fairy being, not the tiny little sprite sort of fairy. This is a very tall wild man type fairy that often is described as having leaves for clothes and things like that. But one storyteller that I met who told me this story said that her relatives all called it Bigfoot, but she knew different. This wasn't a Bigfoot. This was something else. And this is a very specific type of being called the green bean picking man. And so the specific function of this fairy wild man type creature is, and everyone can write this down, especially if you are gardeners, if you are growing beans, long beans, French beans, green beans, any type of bean, but especially the green bean type varieties. You can leave a basket, like a wicker basket, out in your garden overnight, but make sure you put a bottle of beer in it. And then overnight, the green bean picking man, if one happens to be in your area, of course, it will enjoy the beer and then pick all of your ripe beans and put them in the basket for you. So this is a great way that you can save yourself some trouble late summertime as you're starting to pick the green beans and things like that. Let's start talking about some animal traditions, because this is kind of an interesting area. We have a lot of monster lore, we have a lot of animal lore, though, and the lore about the animals is, the specific function of certain animals. For instance, there are several bird species in the Ozarks that have a lot of lore around them. Blue jays, for instance, are seen as the evilest of birds. As the story goes, if you see a blue jay picking up sticks on a Friday, it's taking them to stoke the fires of hell. So just so you know, there's a lot of animosity against the blue jay. I think it's in the corvid family, like with crows, and crows often also get a bad sort of rap in the Ozarks. And I met a storyteller once who had a lot of the animal stories. And I asked him why he thought so many people hated the blue jays. And he just shook his head and he said, they have an unnatural intelligence. And I think that often gets applied to crows as well. Animals that are seen as being intelligent are often seen as being maybe something else in disguise as this animal. So they're kind of looked at with great suspicion. Another of our creatures that has a lot of folklore around it that also sometimes gets a bad reputation is the possum, the little old possum. We have a lot of very interesting possum folklore in the Ozarks. They are, I think, one of these creatures that we encounter so many times, just around the house and things like that. Every time I go out to my backyard, it seems like I have a possum sort of just like wandering around. So they're not a mysterious creature. They're a creature that almost likes to be around humans, if for nothing else than just for food scraps and things like that. And so we have a lot of folklore that pops up about the possum. The possum is often aligned with other trickster characters. In particular, we have a trickster character called Jack. Anybody heard of Jack and the Beanstalk, of course? Yeah, Jack and his discovery of the beanstalk. Well, Jack went on a lot of other adventures as well. And in the Ozarks, we have an entire sort of category of folklore that's just devoted to the character of Jack. in all of his adventures. Jack is a cunning character. He's a trickster character. And so he's often paired alongside other tricksters in stories to teach us a lesson sometimes. And so this is one of my favorite stories that mixes Jack and a possum in particular. So Jack was on his way from his mother's house to his Aunt and Uncle's house, which was 2 mountains over, in a sort of Red Riding Hood-esque type beginning to stories. His mother packed a basket full of bacon and fresh eggs and a couple bottles of cream to take to his aunt and uncle's. And so he set off over the mountain. He had never really been to his aunt and uncle's many times without somebody else, but he thought he remembered the way. Well, after wandering through the holler for a couple hours, he was pretty sure he was going in the completely wrong direction. He started to panic just a little bit, but he came to a clearing and he saw a possum scraping some mushrooms off of a log. So Jack, not thinking anything of it, just walked up to the possum and say, "Hey, possum." And the possum stopped and looked around and said, "Yeah, what do you want?" Jack said, "Hey, you must know these woods pretty well." "Yeah, I do," he said as he was scratching up these mushrooms. "Well, I need to get to my aunt and uncle's house. They're just 2 mountains over. If you can take me there, I'll give you some of this bacon." Well, this perked up the possum's ears. He said, "That bacon would be a lot better than these here mushrooms. I'll take you there." And so Jack gave him some of the bacon, and he scarfed it down immediately and said, "Follow me." So they walked, and they walked, and they walked. Finally, Jack said, "Okay, possum, are we going in the right direction? Do you know where you're going?" I don't know where I'm going, but I'm trusting you that you're taking me in the right direction." The possum said, "Oh, yeah, but I'm a little low on energy, though. I feel like if I had a few eggs maybe in my system, my mind would clear and I would really be able to know exactly how to get you to your aunt and uncle's house." And so Jack thought, he said, "Well, I guess I can spare a few of these eggs. Here you go." So he tossed him some of the eggs. Then, of course, the possum gobbled them up with great delight and said, "Oh, that's so much better. My mind is so much clearer. Follow me. We're going in the right direction." So they walked, and they walked, and they walked some more. And Jack knew that this was wrong. He knew it didn't take this long to get to his aunt and uncle's the last time that he went. So he stopped the possum and he said, "Possum, look, are you taking me in the right direction? Are we going a different way? What's going on?" He said, "Yeah, I know we're going in the right direction, but my bearings are getting off. I'm so thirsty. Some of that cream would probably help clear my mind, and I wouldn't be so thirsty, and I'm sure we'd get there then." So Jack thought for a second. He said, "Okay." He gave him one of the bottles of cream, and of course the possum gobbled that up and said, "Oh, that's so much better. Let's go." So he went on through the woods with Jack behind him. About this time, Jack was suspecting that this possum was probably up to no good. He knew very well that possums could not be trusted. He didn't know why he trusted him in the first place. He never should have. So as they were going along, he could tell that the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and he didn't want to get caught outside in the mountains at night. There was lots of creatures around. The wampus cat apparently was in this area and was sure to gobble him and the possum up both. So he stopped the possum and he said, "Look, I've got to see if we're going in the right direction. I'll give you the rest of this bacon and eggs and the cream if you'll help me get up this tree so I can see if we're going in the right direction, because I'll be able to see the smoke from my aunt and uncle's house." And so the possum thought, yeah, this is a good deal. And so he jumped up on a tree and he said, "Grab onto my back and I'll climb you up to the top of this tree." So Jack grabbed around the possum. They were much bigger in those days. He grabbed around the possum, and the possum but tried to get him up. He was a little pudgy from all of the food that he consumed, so he was having a little trouble getting up. And at one point, Jack slipped and grabbed onto the possum's tail, taking all of the fur off the tail, which is why the possum doesn't have any fur on its tail to this day. And finally, he grabbed a branch and pulled himself up as the possum leaned over onto a branch to rest. And Jack looked around, and he saw smoke coming from the chimney at his aunt and uncle's house in the opposite direction of where they had been going. He said, I can make it there by sundown if I'm fast, but this possum, I knew it was up to no good. So the two of them climbed back down, and the possum started rummaging through the basket to get its food. Well, Jack took the next couple of hours to get to his aunt and uncle's house. He pointed himself in the right direction, and he got there by sundown. His aunt and uncle was really worried about him. He brought the basket in and whatever was left of the food, and his aunt cooked up the eggs and the bacon, and they had cream for their hot chocolate, and she put it on the table alongside a big roasted possum that really filled out the rest of the meal. So that never trust a possum is what we can learn from that, which I don't know why you would, but...
And cats, famously trustworthy. There's a story called The Cat King that I learned originally from, I believe, a book called Ozark Ghost Stories by Richard and Judy Dockery Young. And it tells a story of a Halloween where in the Ozarks, Halloween is just like Halloween everywhere else, where everything can happen. And this one night, this man is walking home on a dusty trail in the middle of the Ozarks, trying to just get home, go to bed. He sees his cat jump across the trail, and he chases it into the woods to catch it. And he finds a clearing, and in the middle of this clearing is a cabin, and around this cabin are just hundreds of cats of every size, every breed, every kind, and he's suddenly stunned. And one of the cats at the back end of this congregation of felines looks back at him and says, "Oh, if you pass any cats on your way home, please tell them that old Kitty Rollins has died." And the cats all nod and kind of appreciate the loss of their cat king. And the man looks around and just nods his hat and goes, "All right, I guess I will." He walks home. As he gets closer to home, he crosses another cabin with a cat on the porch. And the cat on the porch just looks up at him, and the man says to him, "Old Kitty Rollins died." The cat just pumps its little cat paw and says, "Ah, by God, I'll be cat king yet," and scurries off to the meeting. And there's a kind of beauty to Ozark folklore where you encounter the supernatural and things that are impossible, and your reaction is always, well, this is another thing in my day.
Yeah.
This is, we are not meeting the supernatural out of fear as much as we are an obstacle or an annoyance often. The hard scrabble life of the Ozarks, as it were.
Right. Or like Jack, of course, if you're lost in the woods, well, of course you'd ask the possum directions, because they
know.
Yeah, they probably know. I would actually probably not ask a possum for directions. I'd probably find a bird, maybe.
Acting lessons. That's where I go to the possum.
Yes, acting lessons, yeah. So that sort of brings up another story of specifically birds, like we were talking about earlier. So in addition to the blue jay, as it's this evil sort of creature, Ozarkers often looked at the woodpecker too with sort of suspicion, and this is another one of these sort of interesting, well, of course woodpeckers are magical. It's just what it is. Just well, of course if you see a cat, it might be a cat king or whatever. And so the woodpecker, specifically the pileated woodpecker, has some stories about it, in particular of where the pileated woodpecker came from. And so there's a story about an old lady who lived back in the hills, and she was sometimes called Mother Redcap because she had a red knitted hat that she always used to wear. And so she was kind of locally notorious as being both a healer, or, as it often is with healers, they are often suspected of witchcraft as well. So people would go to her for healing potions and charms and things like that, but get out of her house as soon as they could. In reality, she was a very nice lady, and if they had gotten to know her a little bit more, she would have, given them a slice of her famous mulberry pie, or a big cinnamon roll, or whatever she happened to be cooking that day. So as the story goes, in town, the town people kind of got their heckles up one day because somebody accused Mother Redcap of throwing a curse onto his wife instead of delivering her a healing potion. And so, of course, as is the case with a lot of these stories, the town folk got together with their torches, and they went to take care of old Mother Redcap once and for all. So they got to her house, and she was up late at night reading. And so they busted through and said, "Old Mother Redcap, we accuse you of cursing this young woman." And old Mother Redcap just closed her book and nodded. And she said, "Well, if you say I did it." And so they grabbed her and took her out to a pyre where they were going to burn her as a witch. And as the flames rose, they just saw Mother Redcap smile and, in a puff of smoke, disappear as a bird into the tree above them. And this caused a great stir amongst the people, of course, who most of which fled the scene, except for the man who had made the first accusation against her. And as he looked up in the trees, he met eyes with a pileated woodpecker with its red cap, who cawed in laughter at him. And so from then on, in this town in particular, you can, every time you see a woodpecker, remember Mother Redcap. And all the people that live on the mountains still are afraid of the woodpeckers for that reason. So woodpeckers are pretty interesting creatures.
Well, and redcaps in general have a place in folklore as a symbol of some kind of mischievous creature, by and large, does it not?
Yeah, there's I can't remember the name of it. Maybe you know, but there's the mining sort of dwarf-like spirits that have the red cap.
I think they're literally just called
red caps. Yeah. Maybe that's right. Yeah, but they supposedly they dye their caps in the blood of their victims, that sort of thing. Old Mother Redcap. I don't know. Maybe that's a different extension of the story, but
she just had some dye.
Yeah, she just had red dye, probably pokeberry dye or something like that she dyed her hat with. But we have a lot of these sort of origin type stories with certain animals and things like that, and it's kind of an interesting area of folklore. People trying to explain the natural world around them through the use of storytelling and mythology and things like that. And it's also a remembrance. So when we're out in the woods and we see a pileated woodpecker, we can remember the story, and we can maybe take a lesson from it about judging others, maybe falsely, that sort of thing.
Or cats are a monarchy.
Or cats are a monarchy. I mean, I think we all know that.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah. And all cats are vying for that position at any given time.
Court intrigue constantly. Yeah.
One crossover between the sort of monster category and the animal category is, of course, the booger dog.
Yes.
The famous booger dog. The word booger actually originates from the word bogey. So boogeyman, bogeyman. It also has connections to the British, I guess, Old English, Anglo-Saxon bog or bug. If any Dungeons and Dragons players out there, bugbear. The word bugbear comes from the same root word, as well as Harry Potter fans, the boggart also comes from the same. And it just means a sort of a kind of a ghostly, spooky spirit / demon, So the booger dog in Ozark folklore is specifically an all-black dog. Sometimes it's described as even having black eyes. Sometimes it's considered an omen of death, like other black dog or black hound traditions. So you don't want to see one because it will signal your own demise. The boogers are sometimes a category of cryptid. They can sometimes shapeshift into other creatures. So you can have an all-black rabbit who is a booger rabbit, or a booger possum that's an all-black possum. And sometimes they cross this realm between being maybe their own type of cryptid versus being maybe a witch in disguise, because it's said that witches can take the form of these black animals as well. So I have another Jack story if you want to hear it. A Jack story about a Jack encountering a booger. So in this story, as all Jack tales go, they all take place in the same time, basically. When Jack was young, he was at his aunt's house in this low valley area. And as you know, anybody that's familiar with Jack tales, Jack has 1,000 relatives and 1,000 girlfriends. And so this is another aunt of his from the last story. But when he arrives, he notices on the front door that there's great scratches in the front door, in the wood. So he asks his aunt what happened on the front door, if a cougar had come through or something like that. And she says, "Oh, yeah, Jack, we've been having a problem with a booger dog here in the valley. It comes at night trying to get into the house, and I just have to hole myself away in the back and shut the door and wait for it to go away. But I'm sure that one of these nights it's finally going to get its claws through the wood and pry open the door." So Jack thinks to himself, "Oh, I think I might know how to handle this creature." But he wanted to make sure of what he was dealing with. So he stayed up all night the next night. And he positions himself near the front door so he could get sight of whatever was trying to claw its way through. And sure enough, about 2 in the morning, great claws started dragging down the front door, deep into the wood, taking off layers of the wood each time the claws went down. So he looked out one of the side windows, and sure enough, there was the biggest wolf he had ever seen, all black wolf on its back hind legs, clawing into the door, trying to get in. So Jack was very clever, and this is one of the characteristics that always follows Jack. Jack has a mind to work through any problem. And so, of course, years before this story took place, Jack had met with a healer in the woods who specialized in exorcisms, especially of cryptids and spirits and dangerous monsters. And at the time, he didn't think anything of it, but this healer had taught him a trick for how to exorcise any monster that you might want to get rid of, any spirit, the foulest of the haints or haunts that might be in your home, gave him this supreme exorcism that he hadn't passed down to anyone. Well, Jack was young, so of course he forgot all about it until the moment when he needed it. So he thought to himself, I'm gonna try it out on this booger dog and see if it will get it to go away. So he went out the back door and around the side of the house, around back behind the booger dog, and he just called out to the booger dog, "Hey, stop that!" And the booger dog stopped and turned around, said, "Do you know what I am?" And Jack said, "Well, I suspect that you are probably a booger dog, and now that I see your all black eyes, I suspect doubly so." And the booger dog just laughed and said, "Yes, yeah, that's me." And Jack said, "Well, I have something I want to try out on you." And the booger dog just shook his head. He went over to the rail and leaned up, lit a cigarette on the rail. Said, "Okay, well, I have time. I'm about through your aunt's door, and once I get through, I'm going to eat her, and then I'm going to eat you." So Jack said, "Okay, well, if this doesn't work, then feel free to eat my aunt first, and then you can eat me." And so Jack remembered back to the words the healer had given him. And so, for all of you here today, I now want to pass this supreme charm of exorcism down to you. The words that this mountain wizard had given to Jack to send away any evil spirit that you might need to send away, any possum, any booger dog or any haint that might be haunting your house. So Jack got into the proper position, and he looked at the booger dog, and he cleared his throat. Get! The booger dog flinched, dropped his cigarette. What are you doing? You think that's going to work on me? Jack thought back. Okay, 3 times. Okay. Get! The booger dog flinched again. Okay. Jack, come on. Yeah, come on. We can work this out. Come on. Jack just shook his head, raised his palms out. And when you all are doing this at home, you've got to do it 3 times. So on the 3rd time, do a really good clap. Get! And the booger dog vanished into a puff of black smoke. And Jack and his aunt were saved from this creature. So now you all have the supreme exorcism, the most powerful one that I have ever encountered.
Well, and I think booger dogs are such a great way to get back to what you were opening with about how there's so many different variations of these creatures and cryptids and ghosts and things like that. And I think of them often much like a recipe, where every family, every household is going to have its own variation and their own flavor of this creature. Because when I think of the booger dog, I often think of a version that is almost the size of a boar, that lacks a head and stalks around in the night blindly and cruelly. But there's also variations like one that came out of Alma, Arkansas, where a boy saw an abandoned cabin with a shimmering white woman in front of it. And when he approached, the woman was gone, and there was simply the big black dog with the glowing red eyes, and it's growling at him. And suddenly threatened, he throws a rock at the wolf, or at this dog. And the dog, it doesn't go through the dog so much as the dog splits in 2 to miss the rock and then recombines at the end. And this is an older story. It goes almost to a body horror kind of element, really. But it goes to almost the tangibility of ghosts in the prior era too, and these kind of booger creatures. They're not specters. They're physical.
Yeah. Yeah, they have a presence to them. I mean, like the black dog traditions in Britain. It's a specter. It's a sort of ghost, but it has a physical form. It has that physical body. Yeah, and in the Ozarks we have a lot of these sort of otherworldly stories that blend the natural world with the supernatural world, with this sort of other world of invisible spirits and ghosts and things like that, and of course our fairies. Our Ozark fairies. So we have a big tradition surrounding what I like to consider a specific category of fairy or fae being, and there's lots of these different sort of otherworldly beings, but the biggest category is, of course, the little people. And the little people, the name we likely inherited while Ozarkers were still in Appalachia, and in fact, the Muskogee Creek and the Cherokee still call their versions of the little people, or in Cherokee, it's the Yawmichutsti, which literally means little people. And so it was one of these categories of stories that was a mixture of our European fairy folklore as well as a huge portion of indigenous folklore along with that. And so the little people, as they are described by Ozarkers, and I apologize to anyone who is afraid of me saying the word little people, because that is one of these, it's even a danger to say their name in a lot of the folklore, because you risk them showing up. And you don't want the little people to show up at your house. They are trickster beings, and they are sometimes not so nice.
Naming creatures often invites them.
Exactly. And I mean, even the term little people is a way of talking around what is considered maybe their true name, which we don't know, and even if we did know, we wouldn't want to utter. And so in our European fairy lore, we have very similar ways of referring to them: the good folk, the little folk, the fair folk, the gentry, as they're sometimes called in Britain, signifying a sort of different hierarchy of society, even besides our own.
The hidden people in Iceland?
The hidden people, yeah. So these creatures are a very interesting area of sort of world folklore. They pop up in pretty much every culture around the planet. So in the Ozarks, we have our little people, and they are described as looking exactly like us, only little. They are sometimes 6 inches to about a foot in their description. They also mirror our society. They have their own religion, their own language. They have their own cities, often that are built in inside natural springs or waterfalls or these big boulders or ancient trees. So we want to be very protective of these areas, lest we risk, coming across the little people and them cursing us. There's lots of Ozark folk belief surrounding fairy curses and all of the horrible and wonderful things that can happen to you as a result of those. The little people, though, are trickster beings, but they, like in other fairy cultures, they mirror our own culture so much. They mirror humanity so that, they have their own sort of desires, their own wants, their own motivations, just like we do. And just like when we go out and we encounter strangers, we don't know if the motivations of this person. It's the same thing with the little people. They often go to war with each other as well. And so as far as storytelling goes, fairies in general, but the little people in particular, are sometimes a way of us being able to explain ourselves and our own relationship with the natural world and with the invisible world. But the little people are often the cause of a lot of sort of chaos in the world as well. And one fairy creature one of my favorite ones, that is sort of the result of the activity of the little people, are called the corn babies. Has anybody ever heard of the corn babies? Well, if there are anybody out there that grows corn, maize corn, you should be cautious of the corn babies. So according to the legend, you have the little people, and when they want to be particularly mischief, the little people will go into a cornfield before the corn has sprouted, and they will plant their own children in amongst the corn. And what happens is you have corn that grows up seemingly like normal stalks, and they'll even make normal ears of corn. But then one morning you will go out to gather your harvest, and you will see a baby wrapped up in corn leaves laying on the ground. And as many of the legends go, these corn babies are adopted by their finder, by the families that find them in their cornfields. They are taken in and raised as any other human child. It's said that the children and then the teenagers and the adults that result from being a corn baby, they are always lucky at everything. Everything goes right for them. Seemingly nothing goes wrong in their life. They are sort of golden type children. They are said to have a very pleasant disposition. They're very kind. They're very peaceful, very nice people. But you can always suspect that somebody might be a corn baby, not just for these things, but they will also be a strict vegetarian. Corn babies cannot stomach the meat and are often allergic to it. And so a lot of these stories are sort of humorous ways of, perhaps explaining natural phenomena. You can kind of imagine where some of these stories might have come up with, possibly even abandoned children, that sort of thing. Finding children that had been left in cornfields and things like that, and then taking them in. But I've collected these stories from several different families, and they all are very serious about these corn babies. One family the lady I talked to, she said that she had a corn baby in her family, and this person grew up to be a very successful person. But one day, the little people came back, and she was a very healthy person. She died in her sleep, and they said that the little people had come back to bring their child back to the other world with them. So there's a lot of very interesting stories that sort of blend that line between what we consider to be fantasy and what might be reality. In one story of the corn babies, an individual who had been one of these corn babies discovered this about herself when she was rummaging through an attic at her parents' house and found an old trunk that was filled with giant ears or the husks of corn. And when she confronted her mother about it, her mother finally admitted that those were the husks that wrapped around her when she was found in the field when she was a child. Yeah, if you grow corn, be careful with the corn babies. You might have an unexpected member of your family.
Well, and fairy stories are one that I always often hear people talk about, and especially with like little people type stories about where did they go? Why don't people tell these kind of stories anymore? And much like a lot of monsters becoming Bigfoot, a lot of fairy stories became our UFO and alien stories in pretty much every capacity. Changeling stories about abducted children kind of fall back into the same kind of archetypes of aliens, frankly. So it's kind of interesting to see how we keep telling these stories in these same rhythms, but we have to keep updating them for new audiences to seem plausible, which I almost wonder if making them more and more plausible. I don't know that aliens are aesthetically any more plausible than a corn child, but in our modern brains it seems to be, It's an interesting phenomenon. All the way you track ghost lights and fairies and aliens, and it's the same stories with the words just substituted.
Yeah, just slightly different. And I mean, when you look at accounts of fairy abductions, it's not all that different from what people have in modern times described as sort of the UFO alien type abductions.
And the dark man or the black booger figures
Yep.
or what have you become very quickly our men in black.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's just with a more skeptical sort of description.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it sort of raises the sort of, I think, with our exposure to a lot of more fairy type stories, fantasy type stories, I think sometimes we've lost the sharp edge that the folklore actually has. With the little people, most stories that involve the little people are not good stories. They are not. The interactions between human beings and the other world is often a very dangerous thing. And so one story in particular is about a specific fairy being that might also, this is sometimes attributed to the little people as well, but it's called the Crier, or the Crier in the Woods. And this one is described as a particularly dangerous one. So as the stories will go, and this is sort of a conglomerate of a lot of different types of these stories, but a person will be walking through the woods. And they'll usually be on a marked trail, or sometimes, they may be, bushwhacking through the woods, but they'll all of a sudden hear a cry. And sometimes the cry is described as a child crying, sometimes it's described as a woman crying, but they will hear it at a distance, and whatever it is will seem in distress. And so naturally the person will want to figure out what this is. They'll want to, try to help whoever is in need. So as the stories go, this person will go further into the woods towards the cry, and it will sound closer, but all of a sudden the cry will let out, and it will sound farther away. And so they might say, well, that's a little strange, but if it's somebody in need, I want to help them out. So they'll try to get closer to it. And again, the closer they get, the farther it sounds. And so this will continue on until finally, as in one story I heard, the man who was hiking, he got finally on it, and it was a cry coming from out of a crevice, and the cry said, "Help, I've fallen down here." And the man looked over and he said, "I'll help you out." And all of a sudden he feels a push from behind him, and he falls into the crevice. And so as the stories go, this is a fairy being that lures people into these crevices in the woods. And I have my own experience with the Crier, as I don't have many experiences with our Ozark monsters, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. But I do have an experience with the Crier. I was hiking out on one of the national forest trails, and I had a moment that I heard this crying from in the woods, and I had to stop and say, is this really happening? Am I hearing a cry in the woods? But I was like, no, somebody's in need, you know. And so I went out looking for whatever it was, and I swore that as far as I had traveled towards it, I should have been upon it or closer to it, but it sounded further away. And so me, being a good Ozarker that I am, I did not pursue it, but I went and I found 2 national park rangers who were not too far from the trail, and I told them about the cry that I had heard, and they immediately jumped into action and went to investigate. I don't know the outcome. I hope they didn't die in a crevice, but I don't know the outcome of it.
We haven't heard about it in the news.
No. But one of the park rangers did say something very funny to me. He said, "Thank you for reporting it to us. A lot of times we have people that go off into the woods like that, and then they get lost, and we have to come try to find them." And in my mind, I was like, or they die in a crevice. So
The echo, you know.
yeah, I recommend if you ever hear the cry in the woods, do due diligence to investigate, of course, but try to find professionals or at least a friend to go along with you when you do that. So not all of our fairies are of the good fairy variety. But we do have some spirits and things like that that are helpful. We have the house brownies, which are a household spirit that are said to watch over the house and protect it. As with most of these fairies, with the house brownies, the only thing they ask is that you include them in your parties. They don't like being left out of festivities. So whenever you have a feast or a holiday party in your home, it's always proper to make a plate for the house brownies and either leave it on the stove, the center of the house, or leave it outside. And that is a way of thanking them and inviting them into the festivities.
I also think we had a question from over there.
Oh, is there a question? Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to know, when you were on the national trail, did you happen to be in Ponca maybe like 3-4 years ago?
No. So this was the national trail that the entrance is down by Devil's Den. So yeah, down south. Yeah. Did you hear a crier?
Okay, I didn't hear a crier, but I used to volunteer down at the Buffalo, and someone told me that like there was like this massive search that was going on for someone at the Buffalo at the time I was volunteering, like giving information about the elk in the area, and it was because of the fact that someone thought they heard someone in need in the woods, and so they had been lost for like 10 hours. No one could find them. So I was wondering if it was like around that time.
Yeah. No.
Sounds like the setup.
Yeah, no, it did. And I mean, yeah, all of these things can be encountered across the Ozarks, so that's very interesting.
Well, now I'm questioning every time I thought I heard a baby fox like crying
Yeah,
in the woods. It's
yeah.
like,
Well, and
maybe that was one of them.
that's another part of this too. Is a lot of this stuff is also could be based in natural phenomena, of course. So
Well, my immediate inclination is don't follow an echo that you don't know where it's coming from. 'Cause
exactly.
It can seem like any direction.
Yeah, and growing up, I grew up out in the woods, and I remember the first year that we had moved out to the woods, coming from in town and not, having ever experienced that apart from just camping. We heard a screaming. It sounded like a screaming woman in the woods. And my dad, who grew up out on a farm, so he was like, well, it's probably a fox, which if you've never heard foxes screaming, like be sure to YouTube that.
Yeah.
But also, my dad, at the time, he said, well, it could be a fox, but I think it's probably a bobcat in heat, because that is also a thing as well. Later, though, in my adulthood, I was talking about this with my dad, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that." And he was like, "At the time, I didn't want to scare you all, but it was probably a cougar, actually." And I was like, "Okay, thanks for." I was in the woods all the time out there. Thanks for warning me, Dad.
We don't have big cats until you hear them alone in the woods.
Exactly. So a lot of and they do. I mean, honestly, it's an eerie sound, and is so similar to, especially like a cougar and bobcat, it's so similar to what sounded like a screaming woman. And it's very eerie. So a lot of this is probably in part based in these sorts of actual phenomena. but with our good fairies, the house brownies. But my favorite variety of the sort of house protector is the house chicken. And this is an interesting set of stories, and they all sort of go in a similar way, but one that I collected, it was a man and his wife. They lived in a cabin out in a very rural area, and he said that they didn't keep chickens at their house. And he said that, but every night they would throw out scraps, scrap dinner and things like that for possums and raccoons on the edge of the yard, that sort of thing, instead of having them up near the house. And so one night, he and his wife was awakened by the sound of a chicken screaming, clucking wildly, like it was in distress inside their bedroom. And he, of course, woke up to this sound. No chicken around. But they saw smoke, and their house was on fire. They hadn't woken up from the smoke. And so they managed to get out. If they hadn't have woken up, they probably would not have been alive. But he told me from then on, they put all of their scraps in a very nice bowl for the house chicken. And I've heard other house chicken stories as well. And it is one of these spirits that helps people out. In exchange for the scraps and things like that.
Well, that's something I find so lovely about a lot of the animal stories is there's a pretty solid mixture of sometimes these are kind of psychopomp-like entities, sometimes they are their own kind of spiritual creature, sometimes they're ghosts, and sometimes they're just, this is an animal can talk. That's just how it is, and then that animals have such a vibrant part of being alive in this culture, as well as like independent agents as opposed to just creatures.
Yeah.
Any stories concerning beavers because of their
Beavers.
industrious,
Yeah.
building dams, and I can imagine settlers coming across beavers.
There must be.
Did you ever collect any stories regarding beavers?
No, I haven't. No, but I'm sure they're out there, though. I mean, because you've got to have a bunch out there. I mean, they are that sort of feature here in the Ozarks, especially since we have so many waterways and things like that.
Well, they have such an identifiable characteristic.
Yeah, one way of describing, I think it was the side hill hoofer, was that it has a beaver tail, and so it features in sort of descriptions of these other sort of mishmash creatures that it's part beaver, part whatever. I've not collected any about the beavers, and there's not a lot of squirrel lore either that I've collected. Oddly enough, I don't know. I guess Ozarkers were just eating them all. Yeah, they were just eating them all and not really telling stories about them. We're coming up on time, but I do want to finish with one story, which I always have to tell. It's one of my favorite witch stories, and I can't get through any of these without talking about witches just a little bit. So this is one of my favorite witch stories, and witches have played a very interesting role in Ozark folklore because they are often the sort of way that storytellers and sort of common folk have been able to sort of talk about more of the magical, spiritual type practices within the culture. But unfortunately, a lot of times it's out of a place of fear and sort of warning about these things. Part of the work that I do is in actually interviewing and working with traditional healers here in the Ozarks. And unfortunately, a lot of them have not been able to tell their own stories because we've been telling so many witch stories for the past 300 years. But it's a sort of part of our human nature to, in an Ozark context, you have those with the gift, this sort of gift of healing, and then you have the rest of society that is just sort of spooked out by the gift. But this is one of my favorite witch stories, and there's several different varieties, but the version that was passed to me features 3 brothers. And so a long, long time ago, as all of these Ozark stories always start, there were 3 brothers that were trying to make their way through the woods. And it was coming up on night. It was getting cold out, and so they knew that they were going to have to make a camp somewhere, or else they weren't going to make it. Just as they were starting to make a camp, they saw through the trees light. And so they got a little bit closer and saw that there was a very beautiful, what we call giraffe stone house. And you see these around town still. They're kind of a rarity now, but it's where these houses where the siding is made from not rock stacked sideways, but flat. And they look like giraffe skin. It's kind of an interesting feature in the Ozarks. They found one of these houses, and so they said, well, I mean, that's better than any camp. Maybe they have a barn we can stay in or something like that. So the three brothers, they went up to the front porch and knocked on the door, and this little old lady answered. And they said, the oldest brother said, you know, we're going through the woods. I don't think we're going to make it if we stay out in this cold. Can we stay in your barn? She said, oh, I can do you better. You can stay inside the house. Come on in. So she showed him in, and she gave him beans and cornbread for their dinner. And she said, I have a room you can stay in. My 3 daughters also stay in that room. But you can also, there's a bed in there that the 3 of you can stay in. But if there's any funny business, I'll know about it, and I won't be very happy about that. So they of course didn't want to offend this old lady, and they also suspected that maybe she might be a witch. The youngest brother, as they were eating, looked over and spied a cauldron bubbling on the stove. The middle brother, as they were eating, looked over and saw an old book, leather book, on this stand near the hearth. And as they were eating, the eldest brother looked over and saw a mason jar filled with eyeballs on one of the shelves. So they suspected this. They didn't want to cross this old woman. But they also, at this point, maybe feared for their own safety. So the oldest brother was very clever, very smart. So as they were getting ready for bed, the old woman came through, and she said, I've got these 3 sets of pajamas that you can put on, and also each one of you can wear one of these 3 nightcaps to keep your heads warm. So they all put on their pajamas and their nightcaps and got into bed. The eldest brother thought to himself, this isn't right. There's something about this. And so he, being the smartest of the brothers, while his brothers were sleeping, took off their nightcaps. And he snuck across the room and put the nightcaps on the 3 daughters' heads, and then went back to bed. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, he woke up to the creak of the door, and he saw a crooked form in a shadow of the old woman that came into the room, and she was holding a hatchet in her hand. And she felt around in the dark and felt the caps that were now on her daughters' heads. And he just saw her raise the axe and chop off her daughters' heads. So at this point, the brother thought, I got to get out of here probably. It's probably not the place for us. So he quickly woke up his brothers, and they ran out of the door and out the front door just as they heard the old woman scream behind them as she discovered her mistake. So they ran and took to the woods, trying to put on their clothes and their boots as they were going. They thought they had gotten at a good distance, that surely this old woman would never be able to catch up with us. But pretty soon they heard a strange sound behind them, a sound of falling trees, and they heard a thwap, thwap, thwap. And sure enough, they looked through a clearing, and the old woman was flying on a broom through the woods. And as she was flying, she was knocking down trees with her hatchet, one by one. So the 3 brothers, fearing for their own heads at this point, they climbed up a tree, a big, big red cedar tree. And they thought, surely she would never be able to chop through this. So they climbed up to the top of this tree, and the old woman got to the base. And with her hatchet, she didn't even have to touch the bark. All she had to do was say, chop, 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 I chop you down. And the bark began flying off the tree. Well, the oldest brother, who was very clever, he yelled down, chop, 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 I chop you up. And all the bark started reforming on the tree. The old woman was very frustrated by this, so she said, chop, 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 I chop you down. Chopped again. But the brother again said, chop, 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 no, I chop you up. And all of the bark reformed on the tree again. Well, the old woman was keeping at it, and the eldest brother thought, she's eventually going to get through this. We've got to get out of here some other way. And as you know, many of these stories that take a magical turn. The oldest brother, who was very clever, reached over and touched his younger brother, and his younger brother jumped out in the form of a hawk and flew away. Then he reached over and he touched his middle brother, and his middle brother jumped out in the form of a razorback and went through the woods. And then he looked down at the old woman and said, "So long, lady," touched himself and jumped out in the form of a wolf and ate the woman up. And the story ends there, but you know, we never know if the three brothers found each other again or transformed back. But we do know that they at least reached safety in that story. And so that's my final story. But I think, you know, it's with folklore in general, and especially in the Ozarks, such a fun part of storytelling is the telephone game, is how stories change when they are passed from one listener to the next. And so I hope you can all take these stories and take your own stories and tell them and retell them and change them to meet your own audience as well. And keep looking for those monsters. You know, we've talked a little bit about it, but I mean, you know, this sort of belief has changed into the cryptozoology and all of that today. And we are actually seeing the creation of, you know, new cryptids all the time. We were just talking about whether we should mention the Ozark Howler or not.
Because just about everybody I know seems to have a story from their grandfather or grandmother or great-great uncle about experiencing the Ozark Howler. And the interesting thing in the last 20 years of being interested in this kind of thing and reading as many old books as I can find is I've never found a single reference to it.
Nope.
Not a single one. The earliest reference I have ever found to this creature, the Ozark Howler, which, just a brief description, is largely a noise. It is a howl in the woods that you hear. And stories have created different variations of it. Sometimes it's a wolf, sometimes it's a variation of almost like a booger dog. Sometimes it is, if you look now, it increasingly looks somewhat like a bear with antlers, which is just kind of how the visuals of a cryptid evolve. Look at the chupacabra becoming a dog, or an alien to a dog. The best I can decipher is the earliest recorded instance of this is in somewhere in the 90s on an internet forum of a fraternity. I have to dig the post back up, but it kind of becomes this sort of game of telephone, like you were saying, folktale, where everyone now has an Ozark Howler story. But of course, hearing a weird thing in the woods is the easiest to be like, well, that's got to be the howler. So every story you hear about a sound in the woods now can be an Ozark Howler story. So it's one of those things. There will be new monsters too, don't worry. We'll come up with them. We come up with new ones every day, and the ones that will sprout from folklore will sprout on the internet as well. And this is sometimes great. I think the Ozark Howler is a fine addition to the spectrum of our creatures. There are also, unfortunately, a whole cottage industry of fake internet Wikipedias of cryptids that will just kind of autofill information. So you now have goat men sprinkled across Arkansas, stories of goat men with axes and murdering things. But if you look at the stories, they're all the same story. Like, they're not even personalized. It's almost like the McDonald's of your regional cryptid if the, you know, Ozark Howler is one of our more local restaurants. So it's an interesting phenomenon. But stories will keep happening. I don't think we're capable of stopping them.
No, we'll keep telling stories, and I encourage everyone to keep telling stories and collecting stories. And you know, if you have family members that always like telling stories, or if you like telling stories, you know, make sure to keep those. Make sure to write them down, or you know, we have a massive amount of technology to record these things these days. But just think about, you know, who might want to hear these stories later on. And so, for the sake of them, go ahead and record those and keep them. And keep telling stories, keep evolving stories, and you don't feel bad if you don't get all the details correct. Just make them up.
And think about how these stories spring from the place.
Yeah.
Think about the place when you start these stories. I think that's the important thing with all these regional creatures. Yes, a lot of them did come from other places in some of their original formats, but what they grow into is very regional and very local and very specific. And I think always kind of think about the specificities of your stories.
Yeah. And you can't go wrong with a cave as a setting, or
those
or
are
a
in.
forest, or anything like that.
We have bluffs.
Yeah, we
There's
have
bluffs.
plenty of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a shocking lack of like haunted bluff stories, I think.
There
so.
were ridge runners were kind of
Yeah,
Bigfoot
that's
at
fair.
a point,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
But yeah, all of this stuff,
Wild,
don't. Yeah, my thing with folklore is, we can really try and avoid the condensing, that we were talking about, where all of these monsters and creatures and spirits and all of these things have their own names and their own lives and their own stories. And so let's avoid the sort of condensing everything into Bigfoot way of working, or condensing everything into the goatman or whatever it might be, or the howler.
It takes a lot for me to turn against a goat cryptid.
Yeah, I know.
Here we
Yeah,
are.
right. But yeah, let's keep the creatures for what they are, and remember that these stories, they can be unique and they can be separated from each other. They don't all have to fit within a common sort of like overarching mythos.
They don't all have to become Bigfoot.
They don't all have to become Bigfoot. Well, and I was thinking with the Ozark howler too, every howl in the forest doesn't have to be from one creature, but isn't it scarier that it's from thousands of other creatures, separate creatures?
You need the Merlin app for your monsters in the woods.
Oh, that's a great idea. No one's taking that. It's ours. A few minutes. Do we have any questions or anything? Yeah.
Comment. Interestingly, you were talking about Black Dog of England
Yeah.
and tracing folklore as it moves through the Appalachia into the Ozarks. Black Dog is still spoken quite a lot in England.
Yeah.
If you read the British 40 Times, stuff like that. It's still, and it's interesting to be able to follow it. But then you mentioned the chupacabra, and that is probably the only true, I'm not going to use the word cryptid, folklore story that we can trace back almost to its beginning.
Yeah.
We can almost go back to the neighborhood that it started.
Yeah, and to the storm it started in, no less.
I'm sorry?
To the storm it started in, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
It's just amazing that taught us a lot about the proliferation, the spreading, and the movement of folklore. I thought it was
Well, and cards on the table, I used to be a big alien kid that believed in all of this in a very, very big way, but I actually think watching the evolution of the chupacabra is what made this more about stories to me than it became about, like, is this real or not? That's a question that's not interesting to me.
my only problem is that we mentioned Bigfoot. I fear that we killed Bigfoot. Well, I always said I wouldn't leave it till once somebody came in with one title and some good. But the proliferation of trail cams has changed the way that it has to be perceived, if you will.
Well, if you look at populations of black bear and populations of Bigfoot sightings, you see them pretty much equal.
Forgive me, but it was just.
Oh no, thank
yeah,
you for
that
the
was
comment.
wonderful.
Yeah.
I experienced something, I was wondering if you maybe heard anything similar. This is in southwest Missouri, Ava area. I was on a date with my girlfriend at the time, I was about 16, 17, and we're sitting in our driveway talking, and as we were sitting there, we saw a light up in the sky, and it was flashing from one area to the other, just real quick. Then a few minutes later, we saw like some lights in the woods, like, just, I don't know how many, if it's one or several, going through the trees. I thought, well, maybe it was like, some people out there in the woods and the light was reflecting off from the clouds or something.
Honestly, the only story I know of Ava specifically is a non-supernatural one, but of in the early 1900s, the town was just getting a bunch. Everyone in the town was just getting a random check for like $500 to $1,000 in an era where that meant a lot. But I don't know any of the supernatural history of that area. But that sounds very much to me like a pretty ghost light to UFO kind of transition.
Or the spook lights.
Yeah.
There's one other part to that. After we saw the lights in the woods, then I got ready to leave. I was backing out in my car, and she'd gone in. And I saw this whole hillside behind her was lit up with these flashing lights. So it real weird, you know, I kind of wanted to go check it out, and it was a little spooky too.
I've gone to see so many spook lights, and I've never seen one.
Yeah. So
I
yeah,
try so hard.
There's a sort of category of, for those who don't know, there's a category of sort of spectral light, will-o'-the-wisp sort of stuff called the spook lights, which are in mostly Missouri, but there's some places in Arkansas.
I think the big Arkansas one's Garden.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not really Ozark. So.
Curtain lights, a big one.
Yeah.
And there's a million different theories as to what it is. There's definitely the more UFO alien type theory. The sort of traditional approach to it is that these are spirits of the dead that wander as these lights. But then they also have connections to fairy lore as well. So you can sort of make a Venn diagram of where all these things overlap.
Right. It makes you wonder, what's the original story?
Yeah.
And Gertie's looking for his head.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ghost lights where it's looking for their heads, especially if they're a train conductor with a light.
Yeah. Any other questions or anything? Yes.
I heard about the Loch Ness Monster.
Loch Ness Monster, yeah.
We love the Loch Ness Monster. Our Arkansas equivalent would be the White River Monster, which stories go back all the way. I mean, stories go back about a creature on the White River. I don't know if it's specifically the same one, but it became specifically the same one as time progressed, but called the devilfish. And then it was supposed to be knocking down boats and things on the river. And then in the 70s, right after Boggy Creek got real popular and every town decided they needed a cryptid, the White River Monster starts getting seen on the White River as an elephantine creature with 3 toes and a horn protruding from its head. And that's where the refuge comes into line. But that's our closest to a Nessie, I would say. I think the Buffalo River on the Ozark has a bunch of giant catfish stories.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of creatures in holes that will come up and get you, but not a named one as specifically.
Yeah, giant catfish and shape-shifting catfish.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have like a kind of story. It's like not a very exciting fairy story, but yesterday or the day before yesterday, I was at my home. My mom asked me to help her in the backyard. I was going to the backyard, but when I was at the corner, I was about to go to the back door, like some like orb, like it was glowing, a light colored yellow orb, and it was glowing. It went this way, and when it hit a wall, it just disappeared.
Well, that sounds honestly a lot of. It sounds like just about every.
I was like kind of spooked, but also very surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty classical ghost light or spook light story.
If it was a fairy orb or a ghost orb.
The answer
Sometimes
is
it's
no
hard to
one will
tell,
know.
yeah.
I mean, it could have been ball lightning.
Yeah.
It could have been aliens. It
Could have been all of the
ghosts.
above,
Yeah.
too, yeah.
It could have been an angel, alien, fairy.
Yeah.
You know, there's no reason it can't be all of the above.
And that's kind of the beauty of folklore is that, we try to compartmentalize things, we try to label things, but sometimes it just is a mystery.
Yeah, the hippo monster can be a marsupial in
Yep.
Ozark folklore. You know, it's just how it is.
All right.
I had like a kind of glitch in the matrix thing, or a fairy called and when I was putting away dishes, and when I finally put the final knife away, I went back to check if there were any more silverware. Boom, there was another knife.
Oh, wow.
That sounds like a problem.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, no, I love all of the stories. I could sit here all day listening to
honestly,
stories.
yeah,
but
yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope it was interesting for you.
Where can they find you?
So for my stuff, I have a website, ozarkhealing.com, if you are interested in any of my work. What's yours?
And my comic and my series and work can be found at backwoodfolk.com.
Yes. Yeah. Do you have any sketch stuff?
No, so like the Gowrow, you didn't have to pay for entry, so I didn't swindle you on purpose, but this bricked in the middle of the...
Fantastic.
Yeah, I held it together though.
You're good. Do we want to do our giveaway? Yeah.
Yes, I do have a
We do
drawing
have
of
a
a Gowrow.
drawing.
Number 54, right here.
Hey, congratulations.
Thank you all for coming, and keep telling stories.
Yes. First time for a computer to die.
There's something astrological.
I know.
Can I ask a quick question?